If you've ever doubted that miracles still happen, wait until you hear what a tiny puppy did for a paralyzed baby boy. In a quiet town where hope had all but faded, something divine stepped through the front door. Not with wings, but with 4 paws and a wagging tail. This is a story of faith, healing, and the kind of love that only heaven could have sent. The air was crisp that October morning in the quiet suburb of Asheville, North Carolina. A faint layer of mist lingered just above the manicured lawns, and the red and gold leaves from the maple trees swirled in the breeze like memories that refused to settle. The Miller house sat at the end of Wrenwood Lane, a modest single-story home with white paneling and pale green shutters, worn but lovingly maintained. Inside, the world felt heavier than the autumn fog. Rachel Miller, 32, stood by the nursery window, wrapped in a gray wool cardigan, her long blonde hair pulled into a loose bun, the wisps around her temples betraying the fatigue beneath her composure. She had once been a pediatric nurse, confident, precise, and warm-hearted, always the first to speak words of encouragement in a hospital room. But now, her days were shaped not by charts or shifts, but by the unrelenting care of her son. Her complexion was pale, her figure slender but not fragile, and her green eyes, once bright with assurance, now held a gentle ache she carried with grace. Ethan, her 7-month-old baby, lay in a specially designed infant chair by the window. His eyes, a startling blue against his soft olive-toned skin, stared into the middle distance. His golden blonde hair caught the sunlight, but his body remained still, as it always had. Diagnosed with infant paralysis due to complications during birth, Ethan could not move below his shoulders. He made few sounds, and even fewer gestures. Most days, he lay in serene silence, blinking at ceiling fans, lights, or nothing at all. Daniel Miller, Rachel's husband, was 34 and had the kind of rugged, honest hands that told of a life spent working hard for little. With a square jaw and a faint stubble that returned just hours after shaving, Daniel carried the weariness of a man juggling too many burdens. He worked the night shift at a local hardware store, his back stiff from lifting, his fingers calloused from loading shipments. His eyes were tired, but his voice remained calm, especially around Ethan. Life hadn't made him bitter, just quieter. Losing their first child in a miscarriage 2 years earlier had built something silent but enduring between him and Rachel, a shared resilience without many words. Their world had shrunk to a triangle, Rachel, Daniel, and Ethan, connected by love, tethered by hope, and haunted by helplessness. Each day was the same: feeding, physical therapy, tracking the tiny, almost imperceptible changes in Ethan's tone or expression. They rarely had visitors except for the occasional grocery delivery or the polite wave from a neighbor. One such neighbor, Mrs. Penelope Grant, 68, was a widow who lived 2 doors down. A woman of small stature and sprightly movements, she had the tenacity of someone who had outlived both her husband and most of her friends. Her silver-gray hair was always tucked neatly beneath a floral scarf, and she wore large glasses that magnified her dark brown eyes. Penelope had been breeding golden retrievers for over 30 years, a quiet passion that had filled her days with companionship and purpose. One Saturday morning, she rang the Miller's doorbell holding a small woven basket with a checkered cloth. Rachel, startled from her thoughts, opened the door. Penelope didn't wait for a long greeting. "I know you've got your hands full," she said, her voice rich with southern lilt. "But I just had a feeling. One of my pups, he's different. I think your Ethan should meet him." Rachel blinked. "A puppy?" I know, Penelope chuckled. "Sounds crazy. But you'll understand when you see him. His name is Toby. He's the runt of the litter, but he's got a soul that's... well, it's hard to explain. Just let me bring him by." Daniel was skeptical when Rachel told him. "Rach, with everything going on," he said, rubbing his neck. "I know," she replied gently, "but maybe just for a few minutes." And so, the next afternoon Penelope returned, this time with Toby in her arms. He was small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, with floppy ears, honey-colored fur, and the kind of eyes that looked straight into you, wide, warm, and impossibly wise for a creature so young. Rachel set Ethan in his chair by the couch. As Penelope gently placed Toby on the carpet, something shifted in the room. The pup looked around briefly, then walked, slowly, deliberately, to Ethan. He didn't bark, didn't jump. He merely sat beside the baby's chair, and pressed his tiny nose gently against Ethan's open hand. Rachel held her breath. Ethan's eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitched, and then, almost impossibly, he let out a soft cooing sound, like a sigh that had been waiting to escape. Daniel, standing behind the couch, froze. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Rachel nodded, tears brimming. "Yes," she breathed. "I did." Penelope, watching from the doorway, smiled, but said nothing. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She sat in the nursery with the lights dimmed low, Ethan snuggled in his wrap, and Toby curled up at her feet. She stared out the window into the moonlit street and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to believe in the impossible. Maybe this wasn't just coincidence. Maybe Toby had come into their lives for a reason. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something more. The sun dipped low in the Asheville sky, casting amber streaks across the living room walls. The gentle hum of the heater filled the air as October continued its slow descent into early winter. Inside the Miller house, time moved differently now. It was measured not in hours, but in breaths, in blinks, in the nearly invisible movements of a child who had never known what it meant to hold his head up, to lift a hand, to reach. Rachel sat on the floor beside Ethan's therapy mat, her legs crossed and her back resting lightly against the couch. Her hands moved with practiced care, adjusting Ethan's position with slow, rhythmic motions. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing thin forearms with faint lines of faded freckles and a small tattoo of a bird on her wrist, the only impulsive decision she had ever made in her 20s. Her voice remained soft as she murmured encouragement, even as Ethan squirmed with discomfort. It was one of his harder days. His brow furrowed, a tiny pout formed on his lips, and small whimpers slipped through. Beside them, Toby, now nearly 10 weeks old, watched closely. The golden retriever pup had grown a little in size since his first visit, though his ears still drooped comically and his paws seemed oversized for his body. His golden coat shimmered in the afternoon light, and his eyes, round and soulful, rarely left Ethan's face. He had taken to lying beside Ethan during every therapy session, as if by some silent agreement. While Rachel moved her son's limbs through their routine, Toby lay still, breathing evenly, sometimes nudging his head slightly closer if Ethan made a sound. That afternoon, something shifted. Ethan had been especially restless, crying out more than usual. His tiny fists clenched, but his body refused to respond the way he wanted. Rachel's hands trembled slightly. She had seen this pattern before. Agitation, fatigue, shutdown. It meant ending the session early. She leaned in to stroke his head, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll try again later." But before she could begin packing away the therapy props, Toby stirred. The puppy rose on uncertain legs, stretched with a soft grunt, and padded over to the toy basket near the window. With surprising focus, he nudged through the pile until he found the small rainbow-colored plush rattle, the one Ethan had favored in earlier sessions. Toby picked it up delicately in his mouth, then turned and walked to Ethan's mat. There, he placed the toy just beyond Ethan's outstretched hand. Rachel froze, watching silently. Toby sat beside the toy, then reached out with his paw, not roughly but with the same gentleness he had shown since the beginning, and touched Ethan's hand. Once, twice, as if prompting. And then it happened. A twitch. A flutter. Rachel blinked hard to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Ethan's right hand moved, not reflexively but with effort. His fingers jerked once, then again, reaching impossibly toward the rattle. The movement was barely more than a tremor, but to Rachel, it was thunder. She gasped. "Oh my God! Ethan!" Her hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide, and tears came almost immediately. Toby let out a small whine, sensing the change, but did not move. He kept his gaze steady on Ethan's hand, as if waiting for the next motion. Rachel scrambled for her phone, dialing without thinking. After 3 rings, a voice answered. "Dr. Carter," came the calm tone on the other end. "Melissa, it's Rachel," she whispered, barely able to speak through the emotion. "Something just happened. You need to come. Please." Dr. Melissa Carter was in her early 40s, with shoulder-length dark hair, usually pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. A neurologist with a reputation for both precision and empathy, she had worked at Asheville General Hospital for nearly a decade. Melissa had first met Ethan shortly after his diagnosis and had grown fond of the quiet resilience of the Miller family. She arrived within 20 minutes. Melissa stepped inside with a clipboard under one arm and a navy wool coat draped over the other. She had sharp, intelligent eyes framed by rectangular glasses, and her manner was direct but never cold. Rachel led her to the living room, where Ethan lay quietly, his eyes now drifting between his mother and the golden pup beside him. Toby perked up, but did not bark, merely wagged his tail, and then returned to his place beside Ethan's mat. "He moved," Rachel said softly. "I mean his hand, toward the toy. Toby brought it over and he reached." Melissa knelt carefully, observing without interrupting the space between the boy and the dog. "Can you show me where the toy was?" Rachel demonstrated, placing the rattle in its earlier spot. Again, Toby watched closely. Without prompting, he reached out and touched Ethan's hand. Ethan let out a faint noise, more coo than cry, and, after a pause, his fingers jerked again, this time more clearly in the direction of the toy. Melissa's mouth tightened in thought. "He's responding," she said. "There's intent. That's remarkable." She turned to Rachel. "It's not typical, but it's real." She made quick notes on her clipboard, then looked at Toby. "This dog," she said, "has to be part of his therapy." Rachel smiled through tears. "We thought the same." From that day forward, Toby wasn't just a presence in the Miller household. He became a participant in Ethan's recovery. Melissa arranged for the therapy sessions to be formally documented at home, with Rachel keeping video logs of any physical responses. Toby's behavior was also tracked. His instincts, the way he placed toys, how he responded to Ethan's cues, became a subject of curiosity for Melissa and her colleagues. Even Daniel, initially hesitant about the idea of having a puppy in the house with everything else going on, found himself lingering longer at Ethan's mat in the evenings. He would crouch beside the two of them, child and dog, and gently place his calloused fingers around Ethan's tiny hand. "Hey, buddy," he'd whisper, "you keep showing off like that, and you'll be running this house in no time." Toby never needed training to know his place. He simply knew. Whether it was during Ethan's early morning stretches or his post-lunch rest, Toby adjusted. If Ethan cried, Toby was there. If Ethan reached, Toby responded. Some neighbors began to notice the change in the Millers. Rachel, who once looked perpetually weighed down by the day, now had color in her cheeks. Daniel, who used to leave for work in silence, now waved to Mrs. Penelope with a quiet nod. And so, in a modest home on Wrenwood Lane, under skies both cloudy and clear, a bond took root between a paralyzed child and a golden-hearted puppy. Not forged through instruction or design, but through something deeper, something unexplainable, something sacred. The early days of November in Asheville brought a quiet chill that settled into the bones of the old houses and drifted through the golden trees that lined the sidewalks. The Miller home, once wrapped in silence and uncertainty, now pulsed with a new rhythm, one not dictated by schedules or medical appointments, but by something deeper, something unexpected. Rachel stood in the kitchen, her sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows, preparing a small bottle for Ethan. Her movements were calm but efficient, as if her body had finally started to remember what peace felt like. The clinking of glass, the subtle hiss of the bottle warmer, it all played against the soft sound of giggles drifting from the nursery. Not Ethan's, of course. He still hadn't mastered the mechanics of laughter, but the squeaky, high-pitched puppy yips of Toby as he rolled across the floor with a worn, plush elephant. He was now nearly 3 months old, more coordinated, with a shinier coat and stronger legs, but he retained the same soulful, steady presence that first marked him as different. In the nursery, Ethan lay on a padded mat surrounded by soft sensory toys. His eyes tracked the movement of light bouncing off the spinning mobile above his head. Rachel knelt beside him, gently encouraging him to engage, but Ethan seemed distracted today, disengaged. She recognized the signs immediately. His eyelids were heavy. His limbs, though usually inactive, held a subtle tension, and his lips curled downward in the early stages of frustration. Rachel sighed quietly, reaching to stroke his forehead, ready to ease him out of the session. But then Toby stood. With deliberate slowness, the puppy walked over to Ethan's right side and lay down, pressing his warm body close to the infant's. He rested his chin beside Ethan's curled fingers and let out a single low whine. Rachel paused. Toby's tail gave a soft thump against the floor. Once, then twice. Then, still without prompting, he nudged one of the small plush rings closer to Ethan's hand and gave a quiet bark. Not loud, not playful, but purposeful. Rachel leaned back, her brow furrowing. "Are you adjusting to him?" she whispered. Ethan blinked, and then, after a long pause, he moved again. His hand twitched, not with the jerky randomness of a reflex, but with the same emerging deliberation Melissa had noted. His fingers brushed the ring. Toby didn't react, didn't move, just waited. Ethan tried again, harder this time. A small sound escaped his mouth, one of effort. That evening, Rachel called Dr. Melissa Carter. Melissa arrived early the next morning wearing her usual slim black coat, a gray knit scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her dark hair, showing subtle strands of silver, was braided over one shoulder. She had brought a small medical tablet loaded with EEG readings and notes from recent studies. As she entered the nursery, her focus sharpened. "Show me exactly what he did," she said, moving to sit cross-legged on the floor, not bothering with a chair. She was the kind of doctor who always sat at eye level with her patients, no matter their age or ability. Rachel played back a short video she had taken on her phone. The screen showed Ethan lying quietly, his brow slightly furrowed, and Toby gently pawing a toy toward him before lying back down and touching his hand. Melissa watched it twice, her lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. His right hand, that movement, it wasn't reflexive, it's directed, timed, and consistent. She flipped open her tablet and pulled up an EEG model of infant brain activity. "See this?" she pointed. "These are the neural activation patterns during traditional physical therapy, passive stimuli, guided motion. And this," she swiped to the next set of readings, "is from Ethan's last EEG while interacting with Toby. The frontal cortex lights up. It's more active, not just responding, but initiating." Rachel stared at the screen. "You're saying he's choosing to move?" Melissa nodded. "Exactly. And the emotional connection between them. It's stimulating parts of the brain that we normally can't engage in children this young, especially with spinal damage this severe." Daniel, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, walked in and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. His face, tired but steady, had started to carry a new softness around the eyes. "What does that mean for him?" he asked. Melissa looked at both parents. "It means we need to document everything, every session, every reaction. This is beyond anecdotal. If it continues, it could change the way we approach pediatric paralysis therapy." And so, the recordings began. Rachel converted part of the living room into a makeshift documentation station. A tripod with a small HD camera was placed beside the therapy mat. She created a charting system on her laptop, tracking time, activity, Ethan's responses, and Toby's behavior. Daniel, despite long night shifts, learned how to use the camera, often crouching beside Rachel during therapy to help note specific movements or vocalizations. The videos were quiet, intimate records of a developing miracle. Ethan's eyes would follow Toby. Toby would nudge Ethan's hand gently or place a toy strategically within range. Sometimes, if Ethan became agitated, Toby would press closer, providing warmth and pressure in a way that soothed him instantly. One night, something extraordinary happened. Ethan had been fussy all day, and Rachel, worried he might be developing a cold, monitored him more closely than usual. She settled him into his crib and left the room to get a glass of water. Toby, already used to sleeping nearby, padded quietly in and curled up beside the crib. Rachel returned, bottle in hand, and paused at the door. Ethan's head was turned toward Toby, his tiny hand resting near the slats. Toby lay close, chin resting on the edge, one paw reaching just enough to touch Ethan's blanket. Rachel stood there, motionless, and watched as Ethan's breathing grew even, calm. It was the first night in 7 months that Ethan slept through the entire night without waking. The next morning, Rachel called Melissa again and asked whether she had any contacts at Duke University's Pediatric Neurology Research Department. Melissa paused, then said, "Actually, I do. Dr. Leonard Chang, a pediatric neurodevelopment researcher at Duke, became the next person to hear the story. Mid-50s, Korean-American, tall and wiry with sharp cheekbones and a thoughtful manner, Dr. Chang was known in academic circles as a methodical, cautious man, not easily convinced by emotional testimonies. But when he received the first compilation video Rachel and Daniel had put together, he called back that same night. "I'd like to review your logs," he said, "and if you're open to it, possibly conduct a formal observation. This may be worth studying." Back in Asheville, things continued to evolve. The community hadn't yet learned what was unfolding in the Miller house, but Mrs. Penelope Grant, ever watchful, sensed something. "I always knew Toby was a special one," she told Rachel during a visit, her hands tucked into her floral apron, her voice warm with something close to awe. "But I didn't expect him to teach us how to heal." Rachel smiled. "Neither did we." But maybe, just maybe, Toby had come into their lives not to be loved, but to teach them how to believe again. Rain clung to the windows like soft breath against glass, turning the world outside into blurred strokes of gray and green. The storm had come overnight, unexpected and heavy, painting Asheville in silver melancholy. But inside the Miller home, the rain sounded like music, a calm rhythm, steady and soothing, tapping lightly over the roof while the quiet miracle of another day began to unfold. Rachel stood barefoot in the living room, dressed in navy pajama pants and a faded sweatshirt that read Asheville Children's Hospital. Her long auburn hair was tied up in a loose twist, strands falling near her cheeks. She cradled a mug of chamomile tea, warm and fragrant, the steam curling around her tired but content features. Though she still bore the pale tone of someone who hadn't slept properly in months, there was a new softness to her face, a gentleness in the creases around her eyes, a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Ethan lay on his padded mat near the fireplace, wrapped in a forest green onesie with cartoon puppies across the chest. The warmth from the radiator bathed his cheeks in pink, and his lips curled into a subtle, sleepy grin. Beside him, as always, Toby was positioned like a silent guardian. The golden retriever pup had grown thicker in the chest now, with paws that finally matched his size, but he still held on to that puppy gentleness. The tilted head, the soft tail thumps, the watchful eyes that never left Ethan for too long. Rachel sat down slowly, placing her tea beside her and reaching toward a small basket of sensory toys. She selected the plush bumblebee with soft crinkle wings, Ethan's favorite this week, and gave it a little shake, the sound like whispers over leaves. "Toby," she said softly, patting her thigh. The dog perked up instantly and trotted over. With his teeth, he gently took the toy from her hand, and after a brief glance at Ethan, patted around the side of the mat and placed it just beyond the infant's outstretched fingers. Then, as he'd done countless times before, Toby lay beside Ethan's right side, nudging his nose lightly against the boy's wrist. Ethan stared. His lips parted, and then he moved. This time, there was no jerky twitch, no spasmodic attempt. Instead, his arm rose with delicate purpose, a full extension, not fast, not strong, but smooth and entirely directed. His fingers grazed the bee's wing, clutched it weakly, then released. Rachel gasped, the sound catching in her throat. "Good job," she breathed, clapping gently. "Ethan, that was amazing, baby. Good job." And then the miracle happened. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the dog beside him. His mouth opened slowly, and with a soft, breathy sound, he said it. "T-B." Rachel froze. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft rain and the clicking of the heater. Then Ethan made the sound again, clearer this time. "Toby." Rachel dropped to her knees, her hand pressed to her lips, tears springing to her eyes so suddenly they spilled before she could speak. You said his name?" she whispered, the words trembling. "Oh my God, you said his name?" Toby wagged his tail, ears perked as he leaned in and licked Ethan's hand. Daniel, who had just entered from the hallway still wearing his work flannel and holding a cup of black coffee, paused mid-step. "What happened?" he asked, setting the mug down on the table. Rachel turned, still kneeling beside their son, her voice barely a whisper. "He said Toby." Daniel's mouth parted slightly, his expression blank at first, then washed in awe. What?" Rachel reached for her phone and replayed the quick clip she'd managed to catch in the middle of the moment. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Daniel let out a short, stunned laugh. "He spoke! Rach, he spoke!" He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside Ethan, gently brushing the damp hair from his son's forehead. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "That's your best friend, huh? Toby?" "Toby," Ethan repeated. Not quite as clearly, but the intent was there. Daniel pressed his forehead to Ethan's, his voice cracking. "That's the best thing I've heard in my life." Later that day, as the storm subsided into a gentle drizzle and the skies shifted from steel gray to soft blue, Daniel stepped outside onto the back porch with his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped on Mom Jean Miller. Jean was in her late 60s, living alone in a retirement condo in Clearwater, Florida. She was a warm-hearted woman with a fondness for big hats, classic jazz, and handwritten letters. A former school teacher, Jean had always been firm but kind, with a voice that could calm a room and a heart that had room for everyone. She had visited only once since Ethan's birth, unable to travel frequently due to arthritis in her knees, but she called every Sunday without fail. When she answered, Daniel's voice was already shaking. "Mom, Ethan said his first word today?" There was a long pause. Then her voice, soft with age but sharp with emotion, whispered, "Tell me." And he did. Meanwhile, Rachel contacted Dr. Melissa Carter, who responded with less surprise than she expected, but far more urgency. "This could be a breakthrough in neural pathway engagement," Melissa said over the phone. "Not just speech, but cognitive mapping. He associated the dog with sound and formed a name. Rachel, that's not only speech, it's recognition, identity, intention." Within 48 hours, Melissa had organized a private consult and invited Dr. Leonard Chang from Duke to observe Ethan in person. When the neurologist arrived, he brought with him a quiet gravity. Tall and slender, with neatly parted salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses perched low on a narrow nose, Dr. Chang exuded a kind of thoughtful calm. His demeanor was distant, not out of coldness, but out of clinical observation. He watched Ethan without comment for 10 full minutes. Finally, he turned to Rachel and said, "You understand this isn't just progress. It's evidence of the nervous system rerouting itself, adapting in response to emotional stimulus." Rachel nodded. "He only says it when Toby's near. That's exactly why it matters." Dr. Chang requested the video logs, the EEG data Melissa had already sent, and permission to share findings with a peer review board. He proposed an on-site evaluation at Duke's Pediatric Neurolab. Rachel and Daniel looked at each other across Ethan's mat. No words were needed. By the time Dr. Chang left that evening, the rain had stopped entirely. The last of the clouds drifted past the tree line like ships fading into the dusk. Inside the Miller home, Ethan was already asleep, his hand resting lightly on Toby's fur. Rachel stood at the window watching them, her face illuminated by the porch light. She felt something settle inside her, no longer just hope, but belief. The kind that begins with a name. The first snow came earlier than expected that year, dusting Asheville's rooftops in soft white powder by mid-November. Rachel watched it fall from the nursery window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on the fogged-up glass. It was peaceful, almost magical, but her thoughts were far from calm. Behind her, Ethan was babbling softly in his crib, his small voice stringing together sounds that had once seemed impossible. Be, he repeated, and each syllable still felt like a small miracle. Beside the crib, Toby sat with quiet alertness, ears perked, his tail wagging gently every time Ethan spoke his name. The email had come 3 days earlier. Dr. Leonard Chang had officially extended an invitation to the Millers to participate in Duke University's 6-month pilot program for animal-assisted pediatric therapy. The study was groundbreaking, promising, and meticulously planned. It would involve Ethan receiving intensive therapy while being monitored by a team of specialists, with Toby integrated as a primary therapeutic element. They would need to relocate to Durham for the duration of the program. Rachel had read the message 3 times before calling Daniel at work. Now, the decision hung heavily between them, like the gray skies above their home. Daniel sat at the kitchen table later that night, his broad shoulders hunched, a thick flannel shirt draped over his lean frame. His face, angular and weather-worn, was lined with the kind of exhaustion that never fully left, a mix of sleep deprivation and the quiet burden of love. He tapped his calloused fingers against the table rhythmically. "I don't know, Rach," he said quietly. "Durham's 200 miles. We don't know anyone there. I'd have to take leave from the store, and Ethan's finally sleeping through the night. Rachel, sitting across from him, hugged her knees to her chest. Her green eyes were tired but resolute. I know, but what if this is his chance? What if this program could give him more than just a word or a movement? What if it's the bridge? Toby was lying by their feet, his head resting on Daniel's boot. As if sensing the tension, he let out a quiet huff and closed his eyes. We've already come this far, Rachel added, her voice softer now. I think we have to keep going. Daniel didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached down, scratching behind Toby's ears, his voice distant. Then we figure it out. The very next morning, they began making calls, first to Melissa, who was overjoyed, and offered to coordinate Ethan's medical records for the transfer, then to Mrs. Penelope Grant, who was thrilled by the news and immediately volunteered to help however she could. Penelope had just returned from a dog show in Charlotte, still dressed in her practical wool coat and boots with fur-trimmed lining. Her face lit up when she heard the update. Well, it's about time the world sees what Toby's really capable of, she said with a grin. He's got something that can't be taught, but I'll teach him anyway. Penelope arranged for Toby to begin a 6-week semi-professional therapy training course with a local handler she trusted, Brady Keller, a retired K-9 officer turned animal behaviorist. Brady was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with a square jaw, a buzz cut, and eyes the color of slate. Years of police work had given him a blunt demeanor, but beneath the surface lay a deeply intuitive understanding of animals. His thick hands, scarred from decades of training dogs, moved with surprising gentleness when he met Toby. This one's special, he told Penelope after their first session. He doesn't need training, he needs polishing. Meanwhile, word of the Millers' upcoming move began to spread quietly through their neighborhood. At first, it was just whispers at the local grocery store or murmurs during church gatherings. But it didn't stay small for long. One afternoon, Rachel returned home from a quick trip to the pharmacy to find an envelope tucked into their mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note and a check for $200 from their next-door neighbor, Martha, a retired florist who rarely left her home. "You're doing something brave," the note read. "Let us be part of it." That note sparked something unexpected. Within days, Penelope had started a GoFundMe campaign online, sharing Ethan's story with the help of Rachel's old nursing colleagues and Daniel's co-workers. The page, titled "Help Ethan Walk with Toby," featured a short video compilation of Ethan's progress, Toby's therapeutic behavior, and the voiceover of Rachel reading a letter she had written to her son. Donations began to flow in. Strangers from other states wrote messages of encouragement. One woman from Oregon, whose child had been through spinal therapy, donated $1,000 and included a drawing from her daughter showing a dog with wings. The support stunned Rachel and Daniel. It wasn't just the money, it was the feeling of being held up by a community they hadn't even realized was watching. Their isolation, it turned out, had not been invisible. By early December, the Millers had secured a small furnished apartment in Durham, close to Duke University's Children's Neurotherapy Center. Rachel's aunt, who lived an hour away in Chapel Hill, offered to help watch Ethan when needed. Daniel's manager approved his leave of absence with a promise. "Your job's waiting when you get back, and tell that little guy we're all rooting for him." The night before they left, Penelope hosted a small send-off gathering in her backyard. Strings of soft white lights hung between the trees, and neighbors came bearing warm casseroles, mittens for Ethan, and dog biscuits for Toby. There was laughter, prayer, and more than a few tears. Rachel stood near the fire pit, holding Ethan in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder. Toby lay curled at her feet, alert but relaxed. Daniel stood nearby, talking with Penelope and Brady, his arm around Rachel's waist. "This isn't goodbye," Penelope said, giving Rachel a long, tight hug. "It's just the next step." The following morning, the snow had melted into puddles, and the skies were clear as the Millers packed up their car. Rachel settled into the back seat beside Ethan's car seat, with Toby sitting proudly on a blanket next to her. Daniel loaded the last bag, closed the trunk, and took one last look at the house. He exhaled slowly. "Let's go give our boy the future he deserves." And so they drove off, not away from something but toward a new beginning, a path paved with uncertainty, yes, but also with hope. Hope wrapped in fleece blankets, buckled into a car seat, and curled beside them on 4 golden paws. The apartment in Durham was small but filled with light. Pale blue curtains fluttered in the early January breeze from the slightly cracked kitchen window, letting in the scent of rain-swept sidewalks and distant pine. It had been 3 weeks since the Millers arrived, and already the rhythm of their new life was taking shape. The city felt different from Asheville, bustling, unfamiliar, but their purpose here gave every street, every unfamiliar face, a strange sense of belonging. The Duke Pediatric Neurotherapy Center stood on the eastern edge of campus, a sprawling, modern complex with glass walls and warm-toned wood interiors. Unlike the sterile white corridors of most hospitals, Duke Center felt almost like a library, a sanctuary of quiet discovery. Inside one of the therapy suites, Ethan lay on a soft floor mat while Toby stood beside him, tail swaying gently, his amber coat gleaming under the sun streaming through the tall windows. Ethan, now nearly 10 months old, had grown in ways beyond physical. His movements were still limited, but there was unmistakable awareness in his eyes. A spark. A will. He could now grip soft toys for short intervals, his fingers trembling slightly but maintaining contact. He responded more quickly to sound, to Rachel's voice, to the rustle of his favorite blanket. But most of all, he responded to Toby. Rachel, kneeling nearby, guided Ethan's hand toward a textured sensory block. Toby, watching intently, gently nudged the toy closer with his nose. Ethan let out a soft grunt of effort and tightened his grip. When the toy wobbled in his grasp, his face lit up, not just with recognition, but with pride. Rachel blinked rapidly to keep from tearing up. Dr. Leonard Chang stood just behind her, his tablet in hand, a faint smile beneath his usually serious features. Dressed in his signature gray blazer over a crisp white shirt, he observed without interference, recording every motion, every vocal cue. Occasionally he would glance at Toby, who seemed almost aware of being watched, yet never broke his focus on Ethan. On the other side of a glass wall, a boy sat in a wheelchair, watching. Julian Hart was 9 years old, tall for his age, with curly black hair and deep-set hazel eyes that had once danced with energy, but now seemed burdened by silence. A car accident 2 years prior had left him with spinal trauma, paralyzing him from the waist down. His therapy sessions had been irregular, as Julian often refused to engage. He barely spoke to anyone outside his mother and his nurses. But something about the sight of Ethan and Toby drew him in. He came every day to the observation corridor, sitting just beyond the tinted glass, where visitors could watch without disturbing the children. At first, no one noticed. But Rachel began to recognize the pattern. She mentioned it to Dr. Melissa Carter, who had joined the team at Duke as a consulting neurologist. Melissa, tall and composed as ever, wore her dark hair in a sleek low ponytail. Her eyes, always observant, narrowed slightly as she watched Julian one afternoon. She turned to Rachel. "He hasn't interacted like this with anyone since he got here." "He doesn't speak?" Rachel asked quietly. "Not unless he has to. His mother said he was a chatterbox before the accident." Melissa paused, then added, "But you can see it in his face. He's drawn to them." Later that week, something unexpected happened. During a mid-morning therapy session, Rachel and Ethan were working on tactile feedback, Ethan using his hand to press soft buttons on a light-up panel. Toby was lying beside him when he suddenly lifted his head, ears twitching, and walked toward the observation glass. On the other side, Julian sat as usual, chin resting in his hand. Toby approached the window, tilted his head, then turned toward the hallway entrance. As if guided by some invisible thread, Toby trotted out through the therapy room door, left open briefly for equipment to be moved, and into the corridor. A nurse nearby moved to intervene, but Melissa held up her hand. "Wait," she said. "Let's see." Julian stiffened as Toby approached. The boy's hands gripped the sides of his wheelchair. Then Toby, slow and calm, stopped beside him and rested his head gently on Julian's lap. The room stilled. Julian didn't speak, but his fingers moved, tentatively at first, stroking the dog's ears. Then his shoulders trembled, and a sound escaped his throat. Not quite a word, but a sound of longing that had been caged too long. Melissa stepped forward, her voice low. "Julian, would you like to meet Ethan and Toby properly?" The boy looked up. Slowly he nodded. Julian's mother, Vanessa Hart, was brought in to sign the necessary forms. A tall woman in her late 30s and elegant posture, Vanessa spoke with a softness that hinted at strength forged in adversity. Her eyes, full of both fear and hope, glistened when she heard what had happened. "He hasn't touched another living thing besides me in 2 years," she said. "If this is real, if this helps, I'll do anything." The next day, a new therapy schedule was proposed, shared sessions for Ethan and Julian, monitored closely by Dr. Chang and Melissa. Rachel was hesitant at first, unsure how Ethan would respond to another child. But she saw the way Toby reacted, how his gaze lingered on Julian, how his demeanor shifted subtly when both children were in the room, and she trusted his instinct more than anything. In their first joint session, Julian's wheelchair was placed beside Ethan's mat. The older boy said nothing, but his eyes never left the baby. Toby moved between them with a natural rhythm, nudging toys from one side to the other, sometimes pressing his head against Julian's knee before returning to Ethan's side. At one point, Ethan reached out with his right hand, his fingers grazing the soft ear of a plush bear Toby had left in Julian's lap. Julian reached down, lifted the bear, and placed it beside Ethan. Neither boy said a word, but in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition. A beginning. Dr. Cheng stood quietly, recording neural activity via a discrete patch on Ethan's neck. Rachel sat beside the mat, blinking back tears. And Toby, steady and watchful, moved only when necessary. He had become more than a therapy dog. He was now a bridge. By the third week at Duke's Pediatric Neurotherapy Center, the therapy suite had begun to feel like a second home. The walls were decorated with children's drawings, smiling suns, houses with crooked roofs, and stick-figure families accompanied by four-legged companions. The once clinical air was softened by the warmth of routine, the comfort of progress, and the quiet magic of a golden retriever. Toby had fully adjusted to the new environment. He moved with confidence and intuition, gliding across the room with a sense of purpose. His golden coat was glossy from good care, his eyes bright and alert. His every action felt intentional, placing toys, nudging limbs, and maintaining his steady presence beside Ethan during every challenge. Ethan, now approaching 11 months, had started to show more than just response. He was initiating. The subtle tilt of his head, the way his hand moved toward Toby even before being guided, the occasional burst of joyful noise, all signs of deeper connection and cognitive engagement. And now, he wasn't alone. Julian, the 9-year-old boy who had quietly observed from the hallway in previous weeks, had officially joined Ethan's therapy schedule. He was still quiet, reserved, but no longer withdrawn. His deep eyes now followed Toby's every move, and when Dr. Melissa offered the chance to join a shared session, he had nodded without hesitation. Though Julian couldn't walk, he had full upper body strength, and his therapists focused on core engagement, posture, and adaptive physical therapy. He moved in a lightweight wheelchair customized with bright red spokes and a sticker of a fire truck on the side, his favorite. He was accompanied daily by his mother, Vanessa, a poised woman in her mid-30s with a graceful presence and quiet strength. She had dark chestnut hair usually tied into a neat low bun, olive-toned skin, and wore simple, elegant clothes that mirrored her practical nature. Her calm demeanor was born from long months of hardship and unwavering love. Vanessa had paused her career as a physical therapist to care for Julian full-time since the accident. Dr. Melissa arranged the sessions carefully. Julian's wheelchair was positioned on one side of the room, Ethan's mat on the other. Toby would move toys between them, colorful rings, plush animals, soft blocks, and guide each child's interaction. What began as parallel play slowly became something more. On a snowy Tuesday morning, Ethan managed to push himself upright into a seated position using both arms and the support of his hips. Rachel, who had been kneeling beside him, gasped. "He's sitting up," she whispered, voice cracking with emotion. "On his own." Toby immediately moved to Ethan's side, standing close but not interfering, his body a warm buffer if Ethan lost balance. But Ethan held the pose for nearly 30 seconds. Giggling softly when Julian clapped from across the room. Julian, for his part, had made steady gains too that morning. He managed to balance on his own 2 feet for nearly a minute, longer than he had ever done before, his legs shaking but determined. Later that day, Penelope Grant sent a surprise. Her voice crackled through Rachel's phone speaker. "I've just put Sasha on the shuttle. She'll be with you tomorrow." Sasha, Toby's younger sister from the same litter, was slightly smaller and had a cream-colored coat with bright amber eyes. More energetic than Toby, but just as affectionate, she had completed the basic therapy dog orientation in Asheville. Now, she was ready to assist Julian. When Sasha arrived the next morning, Julian's eyes lit up. Toby introduced her with a low bark and a wag of his tail. Sasha sniffed Julian's wheels, then rested her chin on his lap, her tail wagging slowly. The connection was instant. From that point forward, the two golden retrievers took on a tag-team approach. Toby focused on Ethan, while Sasha worked with Julian. Occasionally, they would exchange toys between the boys, facilitating interaction. One morning, Ethan reached out with an open hand to offer Julian a ring. Julian, with steady effort, reached down, picked it up, and placed it back on Ethan's tray. No one said a word, but the room was filled with warmth. Rachel began recording the sessions daily, compiling short clips that showed the boys' quiet exchanges, the dog's unwavering support, and the smiles that now filled the therapy suite. She and Vanessa also struck up a close friendship. One afternoon, over tea in the lounge, they shared stories of sleepless nights, hospital corridors, and the strange comfort of dog fur under trembling hands. Rachel spoke of Ethan's first word. Vanessa told how Julian used to narrate bedtime stories to their family dog. "Maybe we can help others," Rachel said one afternoon, her voice full of quiet determination. Vanessa nodded. "Start something. A space for the ones who need to know they're not alone." With the hospital's support, they launched a small weekly parent group for families of children with severe disabilities. They named it the Healing Thread. Every Thursday evening, the therapy center offered a room, soft lighting, warm drinks, and quiet space. Parents came to talk, cry, laugh, and learn from one another. Meanwhile, the boys continued to thrive. Ethan's core strength improved. He could hold a seated posture longer and began to reach farther with intention. Julian began requesting sessions. He smiled more. He joked. And once, when Sasha barked during a group game, Julian laughed out loud. Dr. Melissa noted the trend in her journal. When emotional safety is established through canine mediation, social response accelerates. Peer modeling between patients enhances measurable gains. Dr. Chang, reviewing the footage, began drafting a case study titled Dual Pediatric Progress Through Shared Animal-Assisted Engagement. It wasn't just about results anymore, it was about connection. And as snow fell again outside the window one evening, Ethan lay asleep on his mat, one hand resting on Toby's back. Julian sat beside him, Sasha curled against his side, their breathing in sync. Rachel and Vanessa sat just outside the door, sipping tea and watching the two boys, no longer defined by their injuries, but by their bond. It was quiet, but something powerful pulsed beneath the silence. A friendship born not from words, but from trust, movement, and the unconditional love of two golden hearts. The morning of the Duke Pediatric Therapy Symposium arrived with a quiet but palpable sense of anticipation. The air outside was crisp, still holding on to the final threads of winter, while sunlight filtered gently through the frosted windows of the hospital's grand auditorium. Snow had melted into slush along the edges of the walkways, but the skies were clear. Soft blue brushed with the warmth of early spring. Inside, rows of chairs were neatly arranged, and the walls were adorned with posters bearing hopeful titles like Healing Through Connection and The Future of Animal-Assisted Neurotherapy. Doctors, parents, students, and researchers from across the country had gathered for this event. At the front of the room, a low therapy mat had been set up for a live demonstration. Melissa Carter, composed in her navy blouse and beige slacks, moved with calm purpose, her clipboard in hand. Toby lay beside the mat, his tail gently swishing as he observed the commotion. His golden fur gleamed under the overhead lights, and a small red bandana around his neck read, Therapy Partner. Sasha, a bit more restless, paced nearby, kept close by Julian, whose wheelchair was stationed just off the mat's edge. Ethan, in a soft blue onesie, was lying on the mat. Rachel knelt beside him, brushing back a lock of his dark blonde hair. The boy's eyes were alert, curious, scanning the faces of the dozens of attendees in the front rows. Daniel stood just behind the curtain, hands in his pockets, rocking gently from heel to toe. Vanessa sat with Julian, camera ready, her expression a blend of maternal pride and cautious hope. Melissa stepped to the microphone. Good morning, everyone. Today we have the honor of sharing something extraordinary. Not merely data or statistics, but the visible, undeniable proof of what happens when science, compassion, and the bond between species come together. You've heard the theory. Now you'll witness the result. She gestured toward Ethan and Toby. A hush fell over the crowd. Rachel took a soft rubber toy, a smiling yellow duck, and placed it about 2 feet away from Ethan. "Ready, buddy?" she whispered. Toby rose to his feet, circled once, then gently nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan blinked and made a soft cooing noise. Toby stepped aside, then lay down just beyond the toy, tail wagging slowly, waiting. The room was so silent that the click of a camera lens seemed loud. Ethan's right hand shifted, then his left. With surprising coordination, he rolled his torso to one side. The audience collectively leaned forward, and then it happened. Slowly, effortfully, but unmistakably, Ethan completed a full roll from his back to his stomach. His face lit up. He let out a squeal of delight. The audience gasped, followed by a wave of applause. Melissa smiled broadly, her eyes shimmering. But Ethan wasn't done. He began to inch forward, one tiny arm pull at a time. Toby stayed just ahead of him, never moving too far, occasionally looking back with what could only be described as encouragement. It was a crawl, messy and uncoordinated, but it was a crawl. By the time Ethan reached the toy, the auditorium had erupted in standing ovation. Rachel covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Daniel had stepped forward from the curtain, eyes wide and stunned. Julian clapped with both hands, while Sasha barked once in celebration. Even the most reserved doctors had risen to their feet, some recording, others wiping their eyes. Melissa returned to the microphone, voice steady but full of emotion. "What you've just seen," she said, "isn't just physical progress, it's relational healing. We are observing a new therapeutic frontier. Our team's findings reveal that emotional bonding with trained animals, particularly in pediatric paralysis cases, triggers a significant increase in neurological engagement and voluntary motor response." She paused, then added, "And it starts with trust." After the session, the family was swarmed with well-wishers, doctors eager to collaborate, and media representatives asking for interviews. But Rachel politely declined most of them. She bent down beside Ethan, who was nuzzling into Toby's fur, and whispered, "We've already got everything we need." That night, back at the family suite in the hospital lodging, Daniel spoke first. "So," he said, "what if we don't wait for another miracle? What if we bring it home?" Rachel looked up from her journal. "You mean, go back to Asheville?" "Not just that," he replied. "We open something, a space, maybe a center, something local, something where Ethan and Toby can help others the way Duke helped us." Rachel considered this, then nodded slowly. "And we'd still be part of the satellite program." Melissa said they are expanding. 3 weeks later, the Millers returned to Asheville. Their small house felt even smaller after the wide hospital corridors, but it pulsed with familiarity and love. With the help of local donors and a modest grant from Duke's Community Outreach Fund, they rented a storefront space on the quiet end of Main Street. They called it Golden Steps. It wasn't fancy. A few mats, a play area, a quiet room with beanbags and dog beds. But within the first month, 3 families enrolled. Sasha remained with the Millers, taking shifts between helping Julian and acting as co-facilitator at Golden Steps. Vanessa visited twice a week, bringing new materials and helping parents cope. The community support was overwhelming. Penelope, now almost 70, hosted a fundraiser dinner. Dr. Melissa traveled to speak at the grand opening. Toby lay at Ethan's side during the ribbon cutting, his nose gently touching the scissors. On the wall, above a painted mural of children and golden retrievers running together, hung a plaque that read, "When science meets love, the impossible learns to walk." Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or angels. Sometimes, they come as a soft nudge from a golden paw, a baby's laugh echoing through sterile halls, or a child's first words spoken in love. In a world often loud with worry, pain, and isolation, God still moves, in the quiet moments, in the unlikely friends, and in the hearts of those who refuse to give up. Ethan didn't just crawl across a mat. He crossed the distance between despair and hope. And Toby wasn't just a dog. He was a messenger, a thread in God's tapestry, woven in golden fur. If you're going through darkness, may this story remind you. Healing may come not in the way you expect, but it always comes in the way you need. The Lord works in whispers. Sometimes He speaks through a dog. May God bless you today and always. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs hope. Like, comment below with your thoughts or prayers, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of love, faith, and the extraordinary bond between animals and people. And remember, you are never alone. The miracle may already be sitting beside you.